and our dear Gilles will somehow try not unpack the components of the ethics as we have already unpacked those, or rather they will highlight their relevance and their importance when we're talking and when we are assessing AI systems. We're extremely happy about that. Katie, you can start with no further delays. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Alexandros, for the opportunity and for the lovely introduction. Hello, good evening, because I think we're mostly in one place for once online today. Welcome to this little talk that we've set up. Thank you so much for being here. So, my name is Katherine Evans. I am a doctor of philosophy with a specialization in AI ethics. I work as a consultant to the IEEE for the development of their certified program, which we'll kind of take a look at in a second. But if not, I also am a little bit artistic, and one of my other claims to fame is that I wrote UNESCO's graphic novel for AI, which is available in open access online, should that interest you. It's called Inside AI. But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. Today, I hope to accomplish a couple different things. The first is to sort of talk about the emergence of AI ethics from traditional ethics, sort of abstract ethics, because as I've understood, in your course, ethics was covered, but I'm an ethicist, so perhaps I can shed some light and nuance into what you already understand and to show how that kind of led to what we're seeing today, which is really an emergence of AI ethics as a significant discipline with a lot of attention both from governance and from the public and from industry. So after that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Gilles Fayad, who will kind of, there he is, who will kind of introduce the certified program, talk a little bit about what it's about and its purpose and approach and some of its content, which will be sort of an example of what I'm going to introduce. And then I will briefly talk about how we might be able to apply this certified program's work in the context of fake news and recommender systems. However, I'll preface this by saying that I'm going to spend a bit longer than I thought on the ethical side and a little bit less on this side, just because fake news, as you'll see, is a very complicated use case, especially given the distinctions that I'll make. And then we'll talk about a few next steps and hopefully some questions from the audience side about what it's like working in ethics and about IEEE's work in ethics. So without further ado, let me get started on my end of this bargain. Let me start by talking about what I would call the original ethical picture. So this is sort of ethics as we've understood it pre-AI, right? So I'm assuming in your course that you've covered what would be the three main ethical schools, but I think it's fun to review them here just so that we're all on the same page. So in Western Occidental philosophy, there are three major traditions. The first and the oldest and the most Greek is called virtue ethics, which basically tries to answer the question, how ought we to live? So it's through the cultivation of virtues or dispositions that we're able to achieve excellence through experience, right? And then always trying to find, given your natural assets, how experience can teach you to move into more excellent positions along your own capabilities. So that's virtue ethics. Kantian ethics, that's a little bit of a different thing. I'm sure we understand that typically as rights and duties or principles, hence the word deontology, but Kant made it famous. And this sort of answers the question, how ought we to treat ourselves and others? So it's important also that it's not just about the principles or duties that we each give to ourselves, but it's also important to notice that they all have to line up, right? So everyone's duties have to together make a system or a society that works, right? Which is why you have something called the universal maxim, which is the idea that if we all acted this way, society would be a good place, right? So that's deontology and Kantian ethics. And then finally, and probably most popularly these days, you have utilitarianism, or its umbrella term, consequentialism. And so this, in contrast to dispositions and virtues or duties and rights, looks more at consequences or outcomes of an action. So it doesn't care about intentions, doesn't care about the context. It simply wants to maximize the goodness, the happiness, or the utility of the action, right? So that action that produces the greatest happiness or the greatest utility is the correct action, and that's the only consideration that matters. So there it is, a 2-minute explanation of the 3 main schools of ethics. Now, there's a point that I wanted to raise that'll be important for the rest of my talk that maybe hasn't come up as often when we talk about ethics generally, and that's what I call the circle of moral concern. So if we can imagine ethics and ethical theories and ethical practice as a sort of club, and different theories prescribe different sizes of clubs or different ways to enter the club. Right. And the club, of course, is the club of moral agency, or those entities that can be considered to have the status of a moral agent and therefore act morally and receive the moral behavior of others. Right. So what's interesting is that over time and across these major theories, this circle of moral concern has changed. It's gotten much, much bigger. So, for instance, back in the days of virtue ethics, really the only moral agents, the only people capable of exhibiting and acting ethically were men interacting in the polis, right? Because women and slaves were all kind of taken away from that circle of moral concern because they were unable to free themselves of their condition of labor, right? So very, very small circle of moral concern. But then with Kantian ethics, the club got a little bit bigger because now we thought, well, aren't we all a bit more the same, right? Universal agents, rational and autonomous, so we can arrive at our own principles and conclusions. And because we can all do that, anyone who can now be a moral agent. So the circle of moral concern is filled with rational, autonomous, human, though, agents. And then finally, with the arrival of utilitarianism, it made sense that since we're talking about suffering or pleasure or pain, any entity that can suffer or feel pleasure or pain must somehow be in the circle of moral concern. And so it got much bigger to include sentient beings, which are things, like animals or even to a certain extent, lower biological life. And then most recently, we've even added the ecosystem to this, right? That the planet might be owed certain ethical behaviors, and therefore it has some space in the circle of moral concern. So of course, the next question that I'm leading into is, where do robots fit in this circle of moral concern, or advanced forms of AI? All these sorts of questions. This is a big aspect of, the transition from human ethics to AI ethics. So in that sense, let's talk about what happens when the machines start to show up. So very briefly, obviously at the beginning of the 20th century, we had some ideas about what futuristic humanoid style machines might be. In fact, the word robot comes from a Czech play that was basically an allegory of men's working conditions under capitalism, which was very popular at the time. And so when we imagined robots, we imagined them more as mirrors of the human condition. And so we would feel for them ethically because that was really us feeling for ourselves indirectly, allegorically speaking. But of course, in the mid-20th century, we started to have real instances of AI. There was Turing machines that started, and McCarthy's original quest to build expert systems, or good old-fashioned AI, and general machine intelligence. And this brought up an interesting question, because obviously, if it's possible to build an intelligent machine, then isn't that machine potentially conscious? Because is intelligence possible without consciousness? But if something is conscious, would that not then imply that it has to be part of this circle of moral concern? It must be a moral agent, because aren't we conscious, and isn't that the seat of what makes us moral agents? That's what makes us able to reason and to understand our place in the world. So then the question of robots or AI becoming actual members of this circle of moral concern really started, right? But then, of course, in the 1990s, things became even more concrete, because though not as advanced as today, regular human beings began to interact with automated systems, even simplistic ones online, search engines, these sorts of things. And so with that, at the end of the 90s, in a very special computer conference, was born the uniqueness debate, which is sort of the birth of the real subject of AI ethics. And that was just to question whether the arrival of artificial intelligence or robots or any automated systems would pose novel moral challenges. So challenges that fall outside of what we typically as humans had to deal with morally. So the types of good and evil that we can do in the world and how that affects us, right? At the time, most professionals and budding AI ethicists thought that no, there's nothing new to be found in machines. It's just a recycled version of human morality. Although I think that given the circumstances of today, that's a very open question. But what's important to remember is that this uniqueness debate sparked, in my view, the beginning of a fork in the discipline of AI ethics, or what was called machine ethics at the time. On one side, you had what I'll call experimental machine ethics. This is the idea of the pursuit of wanting to build an artificial moral agent, almost as a goal or a dare, right? So can we build sentient systems? Can we build emotionally intelligent systems? Can we build consciousness systems? Could we implement moral theories into an artificial agent and have them act like a perfect Kantian agent, for instance? That didn't have a direct practical application, but it's a big source of research still for many different researchers in AI. So experimental ethics being this idea of building sort of an ideal agent or a real, conscious mind even. On the other side, though, we still had all of these machines that were interacting with humans every day. And it started to be obvious that there might be some ethical aspects that need to be addressed. And so that kind of led to what I would call practical machine ethics, which is the idea or aims to solve the problem of preventing automated intelligent systems from causing harm generally, right? So since they're interacting with us, they're causing harm. So what we're going to do for the rest of this presentation, obviously, is practical ethics. I'm going to leave the experimental ethics for another AI talk from another expert. That's not my remit. But now I'll talk more about, in the last 20 years, this transition from machine ethics as sort of a research interest with some practical application to the huge sort of industry and topic that it's become today. So as I kind of just hinted, practical machine ethics has a very basic and obvious justification, which I usually call the argument from increasing automation. This is the idea that if the operational design domain or the context of application of an automated system or an AI involves a social context where human moral value is at stake, then if we don't design a system to be sensitive to that moral value, it'll risk harming the humans in that environment. And of course, the more autonomous or capable the AI is in that environment, the more that risk is increased, right? So the argument from increasing automation, it's important that it's sort of safety related, that it's precautionary, right? And then it's very practical. So we're not here to make wonderful AI that's intelligent and can be a moral oracle. We're really here to solve a practical problem that relates to safety, but safety now construed as an aspect of ethics. So this started, and then soon came the rise of AI ethics and governance, because of course, while it was a research topic for a while, very soon the rise of especially social media platforms made it obvious that there are some harming going on in a lot of the AI systems that are being deployed today, and not just physical harming, but certainly moral harming, like the kind that can happen with virtual agents online, right? Specifically social media platforms. So that got different governments and international bodies interested in seeing if we can sort of curb the negative effects of AI, especially as it relates to algorithmic harm and to human rights. And so this is the beginning of AI ethics as we know it. Important to note, and I'm sure Gilles will pick it up later in his portion of the presentation, but I think one of the linchpins of the beginning of AI ethics came from an IEEE initiative, which was called Ethically Aligned Design, because this was the first instantiation of a lot of the principles that we talk about today, like transparency and accountability, and a lot of the recommendations that came out of important bodies like UNESCO or the OECD actually found their roots in how they positioned themselves and what mattered ethically in ethically aligned design. So it's my honor to be working for this body today, because it was a big part of making my discipline real. And so then that brings us to almost today. And now I'll talk just briefly about a very important distinction that I hope as engineers and people with technical backgrounds, you'll take home and think about when we're talking about AI ethics as we know it, which is the distinction between what I call structural ethics and decisional ethics. So briefly, structural ethics looks at the principles that should impact the structure of an automated system, but also its surrounding stakeholders. So it's sort of its socio-technical system. Most of the principles that we talk about when we say AI ethics are structural ethical principles. Things like accountability, transparency, to a certain degree, bias, responsibility, explainability. But decisional ethics is something a little bit different. This focuses on the ethical principles that should be in place to impact the decision-making of an automated system. So what should contribute to its decisional output? So a good example of decisional ethics and where it matters is in this case of an unavoidable vehicle accident, because it's clearly the machine's decision and the principles that go into it that will affect the ethicality of the output, right? Whether we choose, in this case, the baby or the grandma. Obviously, we're never going to agree ethically on what the best option is, but there should be maybe some ethical principles in place to guide that decision-making instead of pure optimization, for instance. So just to drive that point home again, I'm just going to add some more points to this distinction between structural ethics and decisional ethics, and then that should at least be sitting in your head properly. So like I said, structural ethics addresses the ethical quality of socio-technical systems, so humans and machines working together to provide a service or a product. Decisional ethics looks really at the technical side of the problem, really machine-centric, focusing on decision-making. So structural ethics often addresses a stakeholder's compliance with emerging norms and industry best practices, where decisional ethics addresses really the moral expectations of end users and society when interacting with machines, right? So that's very different. But then if you had to reduce it to a slogan, structural ethics would be how society expects technology to be designed versus decisional ethics, which is about how society expects technology to behave, right? Designing and behaving are not the same thing. And in fact, it's worse than that because structural ethics, what most of the AI ecosystem is focusing on now, does not imply decisional ethics. And that's pretty obvious, right? Because you can build a structurally transparent system that still makes terrible decisions, just as you can build a very, very interesting decisional algorithm that still is completely opaque. So it's important to look at both sides of this problem. And because they're not mutually reinforcing, there are often very many trade-offs between satisfying structural ethical requirements versus decisional requirements, right? So one fun trade-off happens in autonomous vehicles that I'll mention quickly. This is the idea that from a structural perspective, we want to respect privacy, and so that we'll not, let's say, pick up too much information about the other road users in the vehicle's environment. So we'll look at very minimal facts. But of course, if we do that, then on a decisional side, it prevents us from making accurate predictions about expected harm in vehicle accidents. Because we don't know, for instance, the age of the passengers or their gender or much about their position. We might just know their mass or velocity. That may not be detailed enough to make an efficient ethical decision in that context. So in other words, it's very important as people who work on the design side of AI to take a look at both of these, structural and decisional ethics. And the next part of the presentation, where we'll kind of foreground certified for you, is an approach that does, in effect, look at both. And with that, I will leave it to Gilles.
Thank you, Katie, for this great introduction. So very quickly, first, Kalispera, everyone. Thank you for being there. I know it's late for you. And as Katie mentioned, we are both with IEEE SA. I'm an advisor with IEEE. I suppose most of you know who IEEE is and where IEEE comes from. Today, IEEE SA, SA stands for Standard Organization, is focused on advancing technology, promoting innovation, and also mostly protecting safety and contributing to sustainable future. I'm not going to go much into detail about what IEEE is, but just so that everyone knows, if you can advance, Katie, to the next slide. IEEE is really pretty much an international standard organization with participants from all aspects from individual members to contributors who can contribute to companies, corporations, and influencing global participants and global agreements and standards worldwide. So for those who don't know, for example, Wi-Fi was built by IEEE. If we go to the next slide, what you're going to see is that the focus of IEEE since around 2015 has been to advance technology for humanity. And this is a big difference because it introduces a new dimension, the ability to look into, from a technical aspect, we are building technical standards, but the ability to look into the ethical and human aspects of and implications of what is being developed. So if we look at the next slide, we will see that basically with respect to AI system, how does this translate into the prioritization of the design from a human-centric perspective on identifying what are the indicators of success with respect to what we call autonomous intelligence system, which other people call AI in general, and also the ability to define and build something that you are starting to hear more and more in the discourse today, in the public discourse. It's socio-technical standards and system, and I think this is something that IEEE has coined, and that stems out of this advancing technology for humanity. So just in case you're interested in participating, it is open to everyone. Now, if we focus specifically on the ethical aspect of AI and what IEEE has done, and on the next slide, we're going to see that basically IEEE has developed back in the 2015 timeframe a framework called an ethically aligned design, which is basically a framework, a conceptual framework on ethics in AI that goes from principles all the way to practice. And this framework has been adopted very much in principles by many different types of organizations, from UNESCO to UNICEF to OECD to even corporate environments like IBM, or basically other environments there. But the idea there, if we go to the next slide, is that it produces then standards, frameworks, and information in many different formats about ethicality. And what we are going to discuss today is really a conformity assessment program about how do you go about being ethical or evaluating an ethical solution, and also about standards, a set of standards around ethicality, which are going to be described in the next slide. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see that essentially you have a whole P7000 series or 7000 series of standards that address ethicality mostly at the design stage when you develop and design a solution. What CertifAIEd does is having the ability to go beyond that that design stage and go into the certification of a solution that is out there, a product that is out there, whether or not it has been through an ethically aligned design development process. So if we go to the next stage, the concept of CertifAIEd is the ability to build a mark for AI ethics. Now, why would an organization want this mark? Beside all of the regulatory aspects that might come up with either the EU AI Act or other regulations that are coming up, like we're seeing in the US with NIST, the New York rules, the California AI principle, the Singapore AI ethics principles, etc. Everything here is about really the ability for an organization to express its commitment to upholding human values and to build ethicality in, as we are starting to see a sensitivity increase as the awareness of sentient AI is growing. And this is something very, very prevalent today. again, in the press, in the media, all of the talk around ChatGPT and what is the impact of ChatGPT. So organizations and corporations have an interest in showing that they are doing their best effort to demonstrate that their solutions are ethical, or at least that they've scrutinized their solution for a maximum of ethicality, and that improves the confidence in the products that they are putting out with respect to the audience. So how do we do this? If we go to the next slide, what we'll see is essentially that the way you address ethicality in general, you will have to click in, Kathy, to make things happen, is that what you have are risk-based frameworks. And these risk-based frameworks really identify a level of risk. So the pyramid on the left is pretty much a reproduction of what you have in the EU AI Act. It goes from a minimal risk to a completely unacceptable level of risk, and it has use cases pretty much mapped along these lines. But the important thing is that it is assessing the risk, the ethical risk of the solution, and it's assessing it into, when it can be evaluated, minimal, limited, or high risk. Above that, it becomes completely unacceptable. This is exactly the approach that CertifAIEd takes, with the ability to determine the impact of the ethical impact of a solution according to the same graduation level, from low to medium to high impact. And if the way you would do this, if you were a company, and I'm being very practical here, is if we go to the next slide, you will be able to, and you will have to click on this one as well, Katie, you will have to go through a first step, which is inquire as a customer who wants to have their products evaluated from an ethical perspective, inquire about, put an inquiry outside that will determine what is the scope of what you are trying to evaluate, how much would it cost, and how long it would take. Pretty much like any type of assessment that is being done. Once this is done, then basically we go to the second stage, which is really about the profiling of your solution. This is where you basically you demonstrate your solution to an assessor that you will have been working with, and that will come out, this will result through that demonstration and discussion will result in identifying two main components. What are the main ethical criteria that you need to focus on in your evaluation? And what is the impact level? Remember the low, mid, high. What is the impact level of what you will have, the ethical impact level of your solution? Based on that, you would go to the third stage, which is about the assessment of the solution. And the assessment will consist of using pretty much a framework that will have been made available to you, in this case, through the CertifAIEd environment, in terms of identifying which are the criteria, what are their functional requirements, whether they are normative or instructive, the level of impact that they relate to, as well as who are the stakeholders who need to be involved. But all of this in order to identify the type of evidence that needs to be produced. So this approach is risk-based, but based on outcomes. It means that it looks at the facts, it looks at the proofs of the evidence that you as a customer are able to demonstrate. So the customer comes up with what is called a case for ethics, which is a document that demonstrates the evidence with respect to all of these criteria. At that point, this becomes very similar to what you have in low and medium impact, I think, assessment in the EU AI Act, which are, you could pretty much consider them as self-assessment. What the difference that we have here is that we have the ability to go to the next stage, which is to provide an independent verification of that assessment, which is pretty much a certification, and provide a mark that will be the mark that will demonstrate the ethical effort that you have put in terms of trying to get to a solution there. So I'm going to be very quick in terms of articulating the mechanisms of how this works, so that after that, Katie can basically go into the application of this in terms of some specific use cases. So if we go to the next slide, what we are going to see, and again, you'll have to click on this, Katie, sorry about that, is that the first thing that you build your ethical evaluation on are ethical criteria. And these criteria are, we're going to see if we click on it, algorithmic bias today, the ones that have been defined today, and there are more that are coming down the road, privacy, transparency, and accountability. These are the four main criteria. These are horizontal criteria. It's important to understand what we mean by horizontal criteria. We mean criteria that apply across the use cases that you are trying to evaluate. It can be for any use case. You can evaluate any use case with respect to these specific criteria according to a methodology, which is, if you click on it, Kathy, which will be basically rely on these criteria to develop the assessment of the ethicality of your solution. And should you be found ethical, both through your self-assessment and through the certification, then you would be issued, next click, a mark that will basically provide you with a testimony of the fact that your solution has been evaluated to be ethical. Now, what goes into these criteria, I don't know, Katie, you want to take it from there in terms of what goes into the criteria? As you wish. I can do it, you can do it.
I think, no, try it and then I can complement in my section.
Okay, so these criteria are based basically around what we call drivers and inhibitors. That is, for every one of these criteria, here you see algorithmic bias. We have a set of drivers that have been identified, and each one of these drivers can have each one of these, like organizational governance capabilities and maturity, which is the first bullet point that you see under driver influences. Each one of these could have itself drivers and influencers over multiple levels, and each one of these have evidence associated with them. And so when you build your case for ethics, what you do is that you go down that tree of all of the drivers and influencers that are relevant for your solution, and you identify what is the evidence that needs to be produced. And then you being an assessor with the customer, and then the customer basically provides the evidence associated with that. And once you are happy with that, and this is where, from an ethical perspective, you have access to these documents. They are ontological specs. They're available on the web through the link that you see at the bottom of the slide. They're available under a Creative Commons license, and they will give you an idea about a flavor about the first level of drivers and influencers that are there. And there are multiple levels. Approximately every one of these criteria, these four criteria, has about between 150 and 300 sub-criteria for which you need to provide evidence. It doesn't mean that they all apply. It just means that depending on the level of impact and scrutiny that you need to put into your solution, you will have to demonstrate the evidence associated with it. So as we see, you have that for algorithmic bias, for privacy, for transparency, for accountability, which is the next slide. And these are pretty much the ones that are available today, knowing that more are being delivered and are being made available through the same means. Now, this work needs to be done by an ecosystem. So if we look at the stakeholders, what we have are end clients who are software developers or hardware developers or product and service providers who need to have their solution evaluated. And this is performed by a certified ecosystem that will basically provide all of the functions that are needed in order to be able to deliver such an assessment. The first ones are the assessors themselves, who will help the customer come with an assessment and a case for ethics. The other ones are the certifiers, who are pretty much assessors, duplicating that assessment process in terms of a verification, independent verification process within a certification body. And you also need trainers to train the ecosystem to be able to become assessors and certifiers. And for that, you need an organization that oversees and authorizes the different entities. And this is the IEEE Conformity Assessment Program. So in a nutshell, these are the different actors and how they work together. We can go in terms of in more details about what the assessors do and what the developers do, what the certifiers do. Essentially, the assessors help the developers do the profiling, do the assessment, and document and assemble the case for ethics in preparation for the certification. What Certify does is that we help the assessor in terms of training, making sure that they have the right expertise, as verify that they have this expertise, and authorize them and advertise their availability through the IEEE network. The next player is the certified certifier, which is again a role of independent verification. So it's an independent assessment. So it performs pretty much the same functionality, right? But it does it within a certification body. And the third role, the next role, is that of a trainer, as we discussed, Katie. Thank you. That basically provides the training to help grow the ecosystem as the demand grows for AI ethics certification. So you can see the different role plays of the ecosystem. And if you have a background in consultancy, in assessment, in data science, in AI, or in machine learning, you have the ability, you have one at least, or in assessment or auditing, I mean, you have at least one of the components as to how to become an assessor in the industry to provide such assessment work. I think I'm going to leave it to you here, over to you, Katie, for how you can basically, now that you understand what the process is, what the roles are, how can this be applied on a specific use case?
Thank you so much, Gilles. Okay, so I won't go into this in too much detail because as it turns out, to contextualize the issue of fake news, already we have to identify what technologies are behind this phenomenon, because obviously fake news is not itself a technical phenomenon. And then to go through the entire contextualization process would have taken this entire hour talk. So we preferred to give you more of a bird's eye view. But as far as that's concerned, basically I'm summarizing the profiling phase, which is the moment where, as an assessor, you must use your critical ethical judgment to decide what matters ethically and how it matters, which criteria are involved, which ethical values are impacted, and so forth. And so one way that you can look at that, following a little bit of the distinctions that I made earlier, is to take a look at the general sort of ethical concerns that happen. And in the case of fake news, I think often one of the critical technologies involved in that is recommender systems on online platforms like Twitter or YouTube or Facebook, all of these social media platforms. So in that sense, we can talk about the general ethical concerns, which look like the promotion of mis and disinformation online, the undermining of democratic principles, the erosion of freedom of speech. And then the concept of harm, or the risk that we're looking at is things like polarization, racism, hate speech, unfounded beliefs, or echo chambers as a result of an end user's interaction with the platform, especially over time. And the personal responsibilities of end users and the passive acceptance of recommended content. Now, I added that particular one in because this is also interesting to look at who is responsible for which ethical outcomes, right? Usually we do this by looking at the difference between a maintainer or an operator or an original equipment manufacturer. But in this case of fake news, it's also maybe pertinent to look at the end user's role, because as we know, these algorithms and the platforms that they operate on don't have a mind of their own, and a lot of this echo chamber, slippery slope activity that happens and that's been so prevalent in fake news starts with users passively accepting the recommendations that their platform gives to them, right? There's obviously technical solutions and structural solutions that we can find to mitigate that problem, but it also is maybe a bit of a question of individual responsibility to know that you maybe should type something into a search bar of YouTube every once in a while instead of passively watching only the content it promotes to you. So anyways, in terms of structural ethic concerns, I think there's a few that kind of pop out. We can look at the lack of accountability of the operators of large social media platforms concerning the content that they host. I mean, this was a big legal debate, whether they're responsible for the content that happens online on their platforms. Lack of transparency concerning the authenticity or veracity of the content provided or promoted. So, what's the credibility of the people that are posting these videos? What are their sources? Are they impersonating someone official or credible? A lack of transparency concerning the paid or promoted content, both from user-hosted content and on the platform. So how do all the ads run? Who is paying for what and to who? That's often not clear, although it's getting better on these platforms. And a lack of privacy respecting practices concerning the personal data used in content or collaborative filtering. So how are we deciding what's at the top of our feeds? What are the parameters? And this can be both a structural and a decisional issue, right? Because from a structural side, it's the organizational practices that allow maybe for some forms of manipulation to still be present in the way that the algorithms are set up. But obviously, from a decisional side, it is the algorithmic systems themselves and how they're designed and what content they promote that's also at issue. So in terms of decisional ethics, again, a lack of transparency concerning how content is promoted on the platform and to each user, which was the question that I just answered. And then a lack of accountability concerning filtering methods and the potential for filter bubbles, right? So maybe it would be good that we would avoid both technically and organizationally this practice of slowly cutting off alternative options of content to users until they're basically turning around on their own confirmed opinions. So once we've kind of taken a look at the general landscape, now we can move into a brief version of the profiling phase, right? So the first step of that is to distinguish which values are impacted and how they're impacted. So as you saw in the previous slide, an AIS will likely have both structural, decisional, and also rights-related ethical implications. And it's important to understand what applies where, because ideally you want to know not just what the issue is, but also who is best equipped to address it in the ecosystem of the AIS that you're evaluating, right? And of course, as Gilles mentioned in his portion of the presentation, ethical implications can be both positive or driver forces or negative or inhibitor forces, right? So each value that you see as being impacted, like say autonomy, there might be some portions of the AIS that you're assessing that positively affect autonomy. For instance, potentially exposing people to more content for just being on a platform where so much is available, versus negative through the content filtering, perhaps limiting their options over time to align with their revealed preferences, for instance. Once you kind of have that, you get closer to what you see on the right-hand side here, which is this weird daisy-looking thing, which is the ethical center of gravity. And the idea there is just that you should try to find the most reduced, most basic view of the ethical issues or values that you saw impacted. And so some values like dignity might be able to fold into autonomy, might be able to fold into well-being, although it depends. The idea is to have the most simple set that still covers all of the ethically salient ideas into a center of gravity, because that will help you decide which of the criteria sets of the certified program might be the best approach to assessing your particular AIS, right? And so once you've figured out what your DAISY is telling you to do, then perhaps you start looking at the criteria sets. And Gilles kind of ran through that process, but you can see an example of one of the pages before. just below this daisy. So there, as you said, it's not about categorically applying every single one of the criteria. It's about looking at what is listed as a good practice if we're looking to contextualize transparency, for instance, as this criteria set is. And then what the required evidence is. And of course, given your own judgment and your own domain knowledge, you might be able to adjust what evidence is required, or adjust the impact level if, for instance, the criteria set mentions that it's instructive, but you think it's stronger, it should be normative, we must do this, or it has high impact instead of medium impact. There is a fair amount of individual judgment that goes into this, because ethics is a tricky business, as I hope that we've showed you over the past hour. So anyways, the idea is that you roll through one or potentially more criteria sets, depending on the size of your assessment, until you come up with your case for ethics. And then you submit that to the person who has asked, person or firm or entity or stakeholder who has asked for this assessment. And there you have it. That's the beginning of your profile. Yes, thank you. For your time, and happy to answer any questions should they be happening.
Thank you, Katie, so much. Thank you, Gilles, so much. Thank you also, Irene, so much for bringing us all together. Irene, I think you're here. This was a very nice way of adjusting the certified methodology in one of our most hot use cases that we have gone through through this master course. Before I ask the audience about questions, I have this, I would call it a remark, following your final note regarding customize your ethical assessment. In order to actually customize our assessment, is this a job subject to the critical thinking of the assessor, or is it a teamwork between the developer, the manager of the company? And according to your experience, have you ever experienced some kind of resistance from the other side of the spectrum, which is the object and the subject of the assessment?
I think it's the second one, and I'll let Gilles answer the rest of it.
It is absolutely not for the assessor alone to come up with the assessment. The assessor is there to handhold the customer in the evaluation. You can think of the assessment pretty much as a self-assessment, with the assessor providing all of the elements, helping identify all of the elements of what needs to be assessed. And all of this is done in the confidentiality of the customer's environment with whoever needs to be involved at the customer level. What we are seeing, which is very interesting, is that you are saying, are we going to see the resistance? On the contrary, we're seeing, for example, startups telling us, we don't know how to do this thing, and we are very happy that you are able to work with us and help us assess this. Now, they have their own reason as to why they want to do it, because they want to show the ethicality of their solution, because they want to prepare for funding. They might have different reasons as to why they are doing it, all in all, but they don't have today the know-how as to how to do it. They are comfortable with the fact that it stays within the realm of their confidentiality. The solution, they are the ones who are developing the basically the assessment, and the assessor is pretty much a consultant helping them come to the completion of the case for ethics. And this document has a lot of value in the eyes of the customers that we see today, because it is for them something that they can showcase in terms of, here we have done our homework in terms of being of evaluating our solution.
I see. And since the gates of acceptance are open, widely open as it seems, do you think that a methodology like that generates an emerging market, which is about actually going out there, knocking doors, or answering requests and leads in order to go through assessments horizontally across different domains regarding AI systems? Is there a place of glory for new endeavors?
It is actually a new domain, because it's not just an extension of one specific domain. It intersects many different dimensions. The ability to do evaluation, the ability to provide services, consulting services, the ability to understand ethics, which is the least um, known and shared, I would say, value among the ones that I mentioned. And so today, it's quite hard to find people who are able to provide this kind of service to the community. Actually, we are looking for people who are interested in growing that knowledge, because of the ethical dimension has very often been relegated to university, academical, philosophical aspect. But now it is starting to impact us in our daily life, because that reflection that AI is giving us is a reflection that we are forced to evaluate and improve, in a sense. It's not just like, okay, well, we are humans and that's it. No, it's something that we are looking at. We are forced to look into the mirror and to improve ourselves and improve the solutions that we are providing in that space. So I would say it is fundamental. I'd say it's a new domain, quite frankly. For us, at least, we are struggling to find people who can integrate well into that space, because of their ability to bring all of the elements or to learn these elements. This is why the teaching is very is quite substantial. And also, essentially, no, it is, to answer your question, Alexandros, absolutely. It is very much in demand. It's a new field. It's not something that you can come from and bring your own expertise in these different domains. But the ethical dimension is very important to this. You cannot do it if you don't have an ethical dimension.
I see. I don't know if anyone from the audience has a question.
I'm Vasilis Stamatopoulos. I'm a member of the Ethics Committee of Demokritos. I'm quite happy to go over and review quite a lot of projects with regarding ethics and other issues. Just to tell you a few things regarding my personal experience in the legal world, because I recently participated at a conference that had to do with AI, and there were some people that were lawyers, and most of their hopes regarding ethics were on legislation. And when I refer to, standardization and ethics, they were not so convinced that this is the solution. They believe some of them, it's not generic, I suppose, for all legal world. And I'm talking about regarding Greece specifically, that probably standardization is a way around, just for companies and organizations to prove they're ethical rather than be ethical. And what do you think? How can, I've seen in other fields how standardization progressed. For example, telemedicine, that was, let's say, kind of a gray area. Who is responsible for what? Are the doctors? Are the IT? Are the programmers? The networks, the systems, if there are artifacts in the picture, who is responsible? And then standardization and, I suppose, legislation gave quite a few solutions to that. Now we don't judge systems because we know they fulfill standards and we trust them and systems work. I suppose this is something that will happen with AI and all this progress. However, the legal world is not convinced. Have you seen this from your experience, and what arguments could we use, to let's say convince them that probably this standardization is one solution to going more ethical?
I can quickly provide my perspective, but I think Katie would want to add her perspective as well on this. I think that the legal world is a bit fragmented, also for a couple of reasons. You have different types of legal systems. You have the common law approach, and you have the civil code approach, and you have definitions of what is tort, what is safety, what are different aspects that come into play. So you don't have one perspective from a legal viewpoint, I would say. Now, whether it is going to become necessary, I think it is clear, the way things are going, that obviously there will need to be a level of regulation. Maybe it will be at a regional level, maybe it will be at a country level, depending on the different legislations, and it would not be maybe all the same. But all the solutions that we have seen approach it pretty much from the same type of risk-based assessment framework. Katie?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Gilles. Obviously, that was most of the points that I would have covered answering this question. I would maybe just add that standards, and especially this sort of certified program, is a lot more fine-grained than the approach of legislation would be in a particular industry, for instance, right? And it can make a big difference in interoperability, and also can sort of signal at the beginning of an industry standard. In this case, with the ethical mark of certification, that's a great way of saying that they're, sort of compliant towards a future legislation that may not be all that clear, right? So in that sense, I think standards have a clear role because sometimes they can be more technically accurate and precise than the legislative approach alone. And even if in Europe, we're very big fans of legislation first, kind of questions later, I think it's important also to think of how standards can also really bolster innovation in the ethics space, because it's true.
If I may provide one comment here under my legal hat, basically, Vasilis, I would say I would use our experience from the GDPR. The GDPR landed the European landscape as how can I say, a legal textbook regarding data protection and privacy. However, the legal gap, if I may say, the empty space was exactly regarding the actual enforcement of the law in the market and in real society. This is something that in GDPR terms is still not defined. So the good news regarding it, and that's why GDPR is not that much accepted in the wider space, I would say, not the wider outer space, the wider social space. So, but if I think that in the AI, things are quite different and much more measurable, if I may say. And this kind of certificates, I wouldn't limit myself in the term of standards. Rather, I would go to methodology. I would go to this assessment life cycle. This is something that actually allows, indeed allows actual enforcement of the upcoming AI Act.
Just to add a bit to what you said, Alexandros, I think we need to think of it also in terms of what we had in the past, for example, with respect to software, when we were building software, that we were expecting some behavior and some output to come out of the software. Today, with the AI systems, we are expecting as well, similarly, a certain type of behavior. And that behavior is the ethicality of the solution that we are trying to measure here. So from that perspective, whether the demand is there, the demand is absolutely there. How it is going to happen, I agree with you. I think we're going to see the demand similar to GDPR come up through initiatives like the EU AI Act.
Okay, I don't know. Thank you, Gilles, for that. I don't know if there are any other comments, questions, concerns, anything. Vasilis.
So I hope I'm not abusing your time. Just one more question regarding the criteria. Are you considering of aligning more with ESG, let's say, principles, so that the AI will be more, let's say, environmental, socially acceptable, and because the industry is going towards, and governance as well, towards ESG criteria. For example, let's say an AI system is transparent, whatever, but it consumes a lot of energy, like language models do. Are you considering going towards this direction? So if somebody wants to get a loan from the bank, they will probably get some ESG certificate. How about the certification that you have designed?
So from a certification perspective, you get a mark, yes, and that mark gives you an idea about, give you a sense of the ethicality of the solution that you have at hand, that you are considering. Sustainability is a de facto consideration in ethics. Whether or not it is going to appear as a specific criteria or be reflected in the criteria, I think this is something I'd leave more to Katie to elaborate on what her perspective is. But it is certainly a dimension that is addressed. Now, it might not map directly to UN ESG in a specific way, but it will give you, it will certainly reflect the dimension as to the ethicality of the solution from a sustainability perspective, once that is demonstrated within the framework. As we say, there are multiple criteria that are being considered. Today, they are considered at a horizontal level. What Katie went through was the contextualization, which is really the application of these criteria, their interpretation in vertical sectors, in vertical applications. And in that context, in these specific use cases where you have large models, for example, this is where sustainability questions will pop up and will be incorporated within the case for ethics and the assessment. This is the way I see it.
Mm-hmm. I might just add that I think that in the elaboration of a lot of these criteria sets, though not explicitly mentioned, most of the people that were involved in their elaboration have these sorts of considerations in mind. In any case, they're not blind to the idea that there's also trade-offs between the two types of ethics that I mentioned. There is this third, which is okay, it's great, it's ethical, but is it sustainable? Is it consuming the amount of energy that Serbia does in a year? These sorts of things. So I think this is also in the past few years really become another very prominent ethical aspect in the way AI governance is turning. And so I can only expect that though it's already a bit the case, the development of the certified program will try to swallow more of that. I know in my own work, in any case, that's the case.
Great, thanks.
To be honest, I'd really love to make some more questions, but I don't want to abuse your time. I just want to make just one minor comment. This is something that we face quite often when we do this kind of work and approach. Is this cost effective for the assessment customers, if I may say, to be ethically aligned?
So cost effective in a sense depends on your cost. So it's difficult to give a generic answer to this, but I think the value from a customer perspective is that yes, because the sensitivity of, I mean, the realization by the general public that the solutions that are being put out there have consequences or unintended consequences potentially that need to be evaluated, that need to be scrutinized, they will want to see some level of effort being done at the product level. So yes, I mean, from a marketing perspective, if I put a marketing hat, not an ethical hat, yes, it does make sense to demonstrate that essentially you have build that scrutiny into your product, or that you have evaluated your product with respect to these aspects. It will provide you obviously a differentiating position with respect to potential competition, and it will certainly make your product more attractive to the end user there. Another point with respect to what you brought up, I think one thing that we're going to start seeing is that you have a lot of environments where the people who are involved in terms of making decisions with respect to the AI aspects don't have themselves enough of an AI knowledge to come to closure as to what is the right decision to make. And so this is also helping them, in a sense, trying to understand what is acceptable or give them a sense of what has been evaluated in that context. So I'll give you an example. If I am working for a company that needs to outsource an HR system that is going to basically screen the CVs and tell me what are the top 10 CVs or resumes that are best for the job description that I put out. How can I evaluate the ethicality of the solution if the company is not very transparent from the onset on all the aspects of their solution? If they are not saying to me, you are identified, I'm looking at these specific features in this specific context with these specific importance levels, etc., which is not easy to do at the level of an AI system. So how can you evaluate the ethicality of the solution that you are taking? It's something that you see a lot in cities. Like people in cities need to procure, need to buy systems, need to make a decision as to what system they're going to offer so that they can offer services to their citizens. But they are now starting to get concerned about the implications, the AI implications of the systems that they are basically now in a situation where they need to purchase. So there is always a need, not only from a consumer perspective, but also from a company perspective to show, to demonstrate that their solutions are ethical.
Maria, I saw your hand raising.
Well, yeah, I have basically 1,000 questions pop up in my mind, but a very quick one. Let's see. So, Gilles, you have just mentioned guiding the stakeholders, the duty holders, through what is acceptable, basically, and Kate has discussed about the trade-offs between structural ethics and decisional ethics during the process, but at the end of the day, what is really acceptable, and where does the this balance between the structural and the decisional ethics stands? I mean, again, there will be an assessor or a panel of assessors and certifiers at the end of the day that are going to decide and make decisions, and naturally they have their own morality and their own values. So how do we take into account throughout this process about the ethicality, if you allow me the word, of the people involved, basically?
Mm.
I don't know, Kitty, you want to?
Yeah, I'll answer part of it and then you can top me up if you want.
Sure.
Yes, okay, well, so this question of the distinction between decisional and structural is also very, organizational contra technical as well. So there's not always a trade-off to be made. So in some sense, it's pretty easy to identify what transparency means in structural sense, and also in more of an algorithmic sense, and apply both without conflict. So cases where there's conflict are there cases that are really, really contentious. For instance, like ethical decision making in critical scenarios in autonomous vehicles, which happens to be my area of expertise as well as an ethicist. So naturally, no one wants to figure out which principles are kosher or acceptable to decide who should be, intentionally harmed in an environment where you can't avoid harm. But I think that's also a societal discussion. In this particular case, for instance, it's a question of, whether that's up to, us, for instance, as a standards body, or more, regional or national legislation decide if, in those instances, how that should happen. For instance, Germany has already kind of figured out their answer to the question, which was basically to ignore the decisional side and just to do whatever structural ethics recommends, right? And then forget it, besides just harm minimization. The States is looking more at picking up local ethical preferences and trying to adapt those. So it's a conversation, in other words. And I think that there's also, even if there's the individual morality of everyone that's working on, a document like this, there's also lots of practice, right? I mean, in ethics, it's not like it's just up to us to decide what we prefer out of all the smorgasbord of moral theories. There's also things like bioethics, which have a long tradition of making difficult decisions in situations where, there is no such thing as an optimal solution. So all sorts of traditions can be used to kind of mitigate the contentious nature of questions, or to avoid just picking, my favorite moral theory as the right moral theory, because of course, yes, that suffers from a problem of, authenticity, why, or authority, why this approach over others. But I think as AI moves in, as I said, the argument from increasing automation is this: as we automate more and more aspects of social interaction, or more and more automated systems are interacting socially, the need for decisional ethics will also rise, and so will our understanding of our expectations as a society around those points.
But just to close on the point that Maria brought up, because I think she brought up an important point with respect to who comes to decide. It's not an assessor by themselves, okay? It's not the customer by themselves. So first of all, when you do an assessment, there is more than one assessor. There is a minimum of 2 assessors who, at least at the certified level, at the process that we are promoting, there is a minimum of 2 assessors who need to be involved in that process. It's important, as Katie said, it's not a deterministic, scientifically proven, measurable, as Alexandros wanted to say, science from that perspective, but it is something that is at least bound by a process and a set of criteria that is the essence, I would say, the refinement of the work of multiple ethics practitioners and experts, subject matter experts, that is being put to the service of the assessors, and to help them guide and the product developer in terms of deciding what are the important considerations that they need to take, what are the important points that they need to take in consideration. So that's from an assessment perspective. And to your point, Maria, even if the assessor makes a decision, there is an independent verification that is being done by yet another independent verification body. So it's a process where you have independent verification of an assessment. The assessment itself is being made by multiple players, multiple actors, and is based on a context that has been developed over years in terms of AI ethics. So it's not a foolproof system, obviously, but the idea is that it's trying to optimize what it can deliver in terms of ethics in its assessment.
Yeah, I would also maybe add a final little point, just, abstract sense. It's not always that we're identifying what the ideal practice is. It's also that we're identifying what practices ought not to occur. And that's very different in terms of this threshold, right? Because it's easy to say things that we should definitely avoid doing. And maybe the details as to what space that leaves is not always up to us, right?
Yeah, thank you both so much. Thank you.
One more comment. I really like the discussion regarding who decides what, or who decides who decides, or who decides who decides who decides, and this can go on indefinitely. Since we're talking about collective decision making, because I think that this is what this process is about, I was wondering to what extent, since also we're talking about automated intelligence system, to what extent do you see automated assessments? And to what extent should we at least start thinking on how these assessments could at the end of the day be automated?
I mean, I will say that this year there was the Athens Roundtable hosted by the Future Society and the European Commission. And one of the points they brought up was this discrepancy between policing individual citizens, but not using the same tools to, audit and assess different companies. So this is something that's entering in the debate. I think some of the people at the table makes them very uncomfortable, because it's true that it's technically, not maybe possible right away, but probable. It's just that I think that it's sort of flipping the switch on this whole approach to algorithmic societal governance. But I think I'll just say that this is a topic that's starting to become a little bit more spoken about, and I find that interesting as a philosopher. Gilles?
Thank you. So in a nutshell, if I was an ethicist, I would be completely against this approach personally, because I would feel that the essence of ethics is really humanity, and you cannot automate the humanity into the process. We have seen enough of AI unintended consequences to know that the automation of the process, it's hard to bound it to a point where you can say it's always going to behave in the same manner. It is a statistical process at the end of the day. And so you cannot bound it completely from that perspective. That's the ethicist viewpoint. I think the technologist viewpoint is, look what ChatGPT is capable of doing these days. Look at what we're doing with large models. Look at what, and basically, are we able to get to a level of consciousness ultimately that will allow us to do so? I think the debate will always go in that direction. I think there are parts of the process that can be mechanized and maybe accelerated and automated, but it doesn't make the decision making, the assessment and the evaluation as an automated process. I think this is a dangerous line to cross at this point in time, at least.
I will add to that by saying that, yes, I mean, while I'm fascinated by the topic, I will agree with Gilles that as an ethicist, this does sound like a terrible idea, because exactly the hardest issues to solve, and what we were talking about in my portion of the talk, all of the decisional ethics, really, you know, how to have a common sense of judgment in AI is, you know, ceteris paribus reasoning is the hardest problem to solve, and it's not ChatGPT that solved it, frankly. So no, I think you shouldn't be trying to automate ethical judgment. I hope that's not what the plan is, but maybe some parts of the process might be able, you know, could have some collective intelligence going on.
Yeah, well, my personal view on that is that to some extent, some kind of risk scoring things could be automated components in the whole assessment methodology. Yeah, but for sure not the whole process. But since we conclude that the ball remains to the humans, please allow me, because I cannot resist, please allow me to ask myself and you and everyone actually, what's the role of the values, the human values in this process? And what do I mean by that? Let's say we're a group of people that are trying to assess an automated intelligence system. Each one of us comes with different value set in mind. Should we somehow synchronize our value spaces in order to create a value interface, if I may say, that we all somehow match our different value instances? Or should we operate by merely promoting or defending our personal values, objectives, whatever? I think the values is a component that somehow.
I might say that there's a difference, you know, between an axiology and the avoidance of a negative outcome. I think at this stage of the game, ethics is really about avoiding harm, as you saw in the AI action. So before, let's get rid of all the harm, and then we can start discussing where we're heading with this, like the axiological aspects of it. Of course, those are the hardest to align with, right? You know, it's much easier to say what we shouldn't do than what we ought to do in a situation. But I think right now there's enough things that we ought not to do, or ought not to develop, or ought not to implement, that we have to focus on that. And then with the remaining space, maybe value alignment will be a little bit easier. In any case, it's a deeply political question.
I think it's a very important question, and you answered very well, Katie, there. But I think that it's a very important question, Alexander, for one reason as well. If you look at how social networks are shaping decision making and the attitudes of the children and the adults, then at that point, are we building that kind of value kind of um, uh, I'm not a philosopher, so I'm looking for the word, but are we looking in terms of, is this becoming kind of a domination of a specific set of values? Are we becoming basically modeled by the platforms that we are using to the point where we are being, yes, we are being, exactly, we are the ones who are being incentivized or punished in certain behaviors because of the platforms that we are using. So I think there is a whole dimension that we need to be careful about in these aspects as well. But otherwise, I fully agree with what Katie was saying there.
Okay, just to elaborate a little bit on question of Alexandros, it's the axiology, but you know, the values with the criteria, sometimes there is quite a lot of overlap, especially when we're talking about different cultures. For example, transparency is not valued everywhere the same. So we have a criteria that reflects to a value. And I'm just trying to project how is this going to work in a worldwide environment. Will somebody, let's say, get a certificate for some countries that value transparency, and what happens with some other countries? Will they?
That's a very good point, Vasilis. So let me just answer it
Sure.
from a technical perspective very quickly. When you get a certification, it comes with conditions, and the conditions are really the do's and the don'ts, like what you should do and what you should not be doing. It also comes with a scope, like what is the scope of utilization of the solution, that the product, right? It has been evaluated within a specific scope. If it is being used in a different scope, then basically it would not be considered ethical. Let's assume I have built a tool, it is a knife. At the end of the day, the ethicality is in the way I'm using that knife. I can use it to cut something and do something beautiful out of it, or I can use it to harm someone. So from a certification perspective, what you get is a certificate that is valid for a specific usage in a specific territory. And the territory has, as you might say, transparency might be different in one territory or another territory, or the level of accountability might be different as well, etc. It's not to say that it is ethical or non-ethical. You have basically universal values that cut across, but you have different levels of, I would say, interpretation at the level of these ethical values. You have small variations that happen. It's a spectrum. It's not a black and white, binary approach on things. And the certification is focused on the usage in a given environment. It is not like you get a certificate, you apply it worldwide for the product the way you want. It's not just the product, it's the organization, it is the usage of the product, where it's going to be used, how the stakeholders are being evaluated at the same time as the solution in itself.
Good, great, thanks.
Yeah, I might just add that this issue of ethical relativism or moral relativism, I think that it would be a mistake to think that the certified process and criteria sets would be so commanding that they would erase cultural differences and nuance. Again, it's not about saying what we ought to do at all costs all the time. It's also about avoiding things that automatically are bad ideas, kind of regardless of the context, right? And I know that in the way that we develop certified, we're very sensitive to the ethical differences and nuances and sort of the common sense morality of different parts of the world. So that, because the idea is also for us to have a criteria set that isn't so demanding and imposing that it would erase those things that would also usefully benefit the products that they're developing, right? So I don't think there's so much of a trade-off there.
Yeah, everyone is reading the question, basically. Thank you, Constantine. What do you mean by fighting? I think fighting is a very, which, if I may answer this question, I could say we can have both, in the sense that we understand that it's not a robust scientific methodology, technically speaking. I mean, it's not binary. Katie, I want to say, what I want to say is that it's not binary. It doesn't mean that it doesn't follow a strict, or let's say an acceptable scientific methodology. So from this point of view, I think that robustness is there, but it's still under construction.
I might add that in the case of ethics, and by extension in this context, standards, we have to be careful of the difference between an ought and an is, right? So when we're talking about methodologies, empirically, we can derive a bunch of different things and approach things empirically, collect all sorts of data, but at the end of the day, though empiricism has to inform this process, normativity is a thing unto its own. You know, Hume's fork, an ought does not imply an is, and vice versa. And so I think the work of ethics of AI is also to talk about how things ought to be. And so this addresses less your dialectic question, but the idea of having like a scientific method to develop ethics, I mean, it's going to be hard because so much of it, it lives in the world of expectations, right? So I think it's important to have one inform the other, but to still keep them conceptually separate and not want to collapse one into the other.
I think this is somehow separated in the sense that it goes without saying that many different disciplines collaborate in order to provide an ethical outcome regarding automatic intelligent systems. So yeah, the methodology comes from this intersection. So I see a lot of established scientific processes coming together, generating something new. So from that point of view, yes. Yeah.
Just to address it from the process perspective again, I'm talking about the tool here. The certification or the assessment process is an outcome-based process. So it is trying to measure evidence. That evidence in itself might not be rigorous to the 2 + 2 = 4, but is as robust, I would say, as the factual evidence that you provide in a court in terms of evaluating something, right? You are evaluating something, you are coming to a conclusion as to whether the evidence applies or does not apply. Is it relevant? Is it not relevant? Does it confirm or does it infirm what you are trying to assess? So from that perspective, the fact that it is outcome-based, that it is focused on the evidence, I think helps get to the point where you have something that is robust within the limits of what robustness can be, what robustness is today in our societies and what is acceptable in our societies today. If you have to demonstrate that you have not broken the law because in a specific use case, you can demonstrate it as well with evidence. So it is about, I'm using terms that might be layman terms for me because I'm more of a technologist than anything else, but it is really about demonstrating outcomes, and on that basis, it is quite robust, I would say, personally.
And I also think that what was mentioned before, that starting from not doing harm rather than thinking what I ought to do, is a very nice and robust starting point for the emerging ethical assessments. So thank you for this, Katie, and thank you for this, Gilles. I am really happy that I see a lot of interaction and a lot of the discussion is very, very interesting. I don't know, but I think I have the feeling that I need to stop here somewhere. Although I'd love to keep going with e-drinks and e-discussions, but unfortunately this is not the case. On our side, from me and Maria, that we need to share our very positive feelings regarding the ethics master course, the ethics module in this AI master course, because we see that things do actually evolve. We see a lot of different bits and pieces coming actually together and bringing robust results like the certified methodology, that needless to say how happy me and Maria are that we have started this journey within the IEEE ecosystem. So as far as it concerns myself, and I think for Maria for sure, we are very much excited, and we think that the outputs will be quite measurable, tangible, and practical. A final statement from you guys?
Please care about ethics.
Okay. Thank you.
Saristo, thank you very much. It was really a pleasure. The questions are very important, and we need more of such discussions, because I think the discussions in themselves are very useful for everyone, including us, in terms of grasping the importance of things and the perceptions as to what is the perception out there and how to best understand or explain things. So thank you very much for all these questions, and thank you for the opportunity to share this, Alessandros and Maria, with the rest of the team here. It's we appreciate it very much. Thank you.
The pleasure was all ours. Thank you.
And thank you to all that joined us today.